see them. Sometimes we look at these in the laboratory. I guess we didn't look at them this semester, but they're kind of fun to look at under the microscope. They have lots of little cilia to swim around, and you can put tiny bits of food in them, like little fungal cells for them to eat. You can watch them munching them down. And some of these protista are photosynthetic. Here's one called a euglena. It swims around, but it's plant-like in the sense that it has chloroplasts inside as its way of feeding itself. All right, now most members of the protista kingdom are unicellular, but there are some multicellular forms. Our present-day kelps and seaweeds are multicellular protistans. And they think from the protista kingdom, mostly the single-celled eukaryotes, you eventually got more and more multicellular forms. Plants, they believe, evolved from a multicellular green algae. The algae is another word for the photosynthetic protistans. There's brown algae and golden brown algae and red algae and green algae. And I guess just based on the fact that our plants are green, so their photosynthetic pigments are most closely related to the green algae, that's why they think it's the ancestor of plants. But plants, by definition, are adapted to the land. And so they think around 400 million years ago, some species of green algae slowly began to adapt to life, not in the water, but on the land. And from those first primitive plants that were direct ancestors of green algae, all the modern plants eventually evolved. Now, back into the ocean for a second. The non-photosynthetic protistans, they think, were also evolving into multicellular forms. Since this is still going on in the ocean, these were things that lived in the ocean at first. Fungal forms, they think fungi are evolved from non-photosynthetic protistans, as were the first animals. Now, the first animals were relatively simple. You obviously didn't have elephants and human beings just popping up from some single cellular protistan, but think of things like worms and squids, and eventually fishes evolved from the non-photosynthetic protistans. I want to kind of focus in on the animal kingdom here for a second. Eventually, also around 400 million years ago, they think some of the fish that were in the seas started adapting to the land. And why they would do this, they're not sure. Maybe to escape from predators, maybe as a way of escaping predators, they could just flop on the muddy shores for a while, or maybe for mating purposes, or maybe to go from one mud hole to another. But eventually they started spending longer and longer times on the dry land. And the first group that was to evolve from the fishes trying to get on the dry land are called the amphibians. And we have examples of these now. Things like frogs and newts and salamanders are amphibians. And so these are animals that have to spend at least part of their lifetime in the water, but they can also live on land, at least for short periods of time. And amphibians tend to have very porous skin. Their skin doesn't hold stop water from evaporating, which it doesn't have to because they normally live in moist environments. And likewise, their eggs don't have any sort of way of stopping themselves from drying out. They sort of have a gelatinous cover to them. But that's fine, again, because these amphibians normally mate and lay their eggs in the water. Now, there's many different types of fish in the ocean, but they think they know the type that was the ancestor of the amphibians. There's a type of fish called a lobed fin fish that has many traits in common with amphibians these days. These lobed fin fish, to begin with, have bony skeletons, and not all fish do. Some fish have cartilage for their skeletons. And furthermore, if you look at the bone structure in the fins of these lobed fin fish, it's reminiscent of the bone structure that you find in amphibians, and in fact all land animals have fairly similar bone structures in their limbs. And this I thought was neat. There are some current species of fish which we see dew coming out of the water for brief periods of time. In some areas in the United States, you find certain species of catfish that if the mud hole they're living in starts to dry out, they can actually flop out and flop along the ground until they find a new mud hole. Which, you know, nobody's saying that these particular catfish were the ancestors of land animals, but nevertheless, it does show that natural selection can favor a fish to come out of the water for short periods of time. All right, so there's an artist's creation of maybe some intermediate between a fish and amphibian coming out of the water to stay on the mud for longer and longer periods of time. And remember, this was around 400 million years ago when the plants were first adapting to the land. Oh, there's one of these early amphibians right there. All right, now after the amphibians got a foothold on the land, so to speak, the next major group to evolve are the reptiles. Reptiles share some features in common with the amphibians, like the basic skeletal structure is very similar, but the reptiles are more adapted to longer periods away from the water. Reptiles have a thick leathery skin so that they don't dry out when they're not in the water, and likewise their eggs have a harder waterproof covering so the eggs don't dry out on the dry land. And the reptiles were a very proliferative group. They evolved into several other species. The birds and the dinosaurs, they think, both came out of the reptile group. And when I was making this series of slides you're seeing right here, there was still some controversy. People were still debating whether birds came directly out of reptiles or are actually an evolved type of dinosaur. And so the current thinking is more from the dinosaurs than directly from the reptiles. So I really should fix this slide. Imagine this arrow coming from the dinosaur to the bird, and that would be more accurate what they believe is going on today. Now, we've all heard about the dinosaurs, essentially just huge, giant forms of reptiles, and they dominated the earth for the long time, meaning that the other life forms were relatively small. The other animal life forms were relatively small, and these guys had the top positions on the food chain, and some of them were just enormous in size. And so they were the top animals on the face of the earth. But you probably know what happened to them. The Earth's climate was suddenly changed by an asteroid impact. They think around 65 million years ago, a giant asteroid slammed into the Earth, and they're pretty sure they know where it happened. In the area of Mexico called the Yucatan Peninsula on the eastern coast of Mexico, they find some evidence in the Earth crust of a giant impact right around 65 million years ago. And this not only killed off the dinosaurs, it killed off a lot of species as well. A lot of the mammal species as well died off. And they're still debating what exactly happened. Some people think it was like a big heat blast that essentially steam from the heat of the impact covered a lot of the earth and barbecued a lot of the creatures. And other people think, well, maybe that happened, but it probably also kicked up a lot of dust, which darkened the sunlight for several years. And so maybe the climate change got them. But for whatever reason, a lot of species went extinct, especially a lot of the dinosaurs. And in a sense, that opened up some spots at the top of the food chain for other smaller animals to evolve to larger sizes and take over those positions that were vacated by the dinosaurs. So mammals really started evolving once the dinosaurs were wiped out. And there were actually mammals around before the dinosaurs came along, but as I said, they were mostly small. They were probably just trying to hide and stay out of the way of the dinosaurs so they didn't get eaten. What defines a mammal is mammary glands. Mammals nurse their young, whereas birds and reptiles do not. And mammals are warm-blooded as well. So anyway, with the dinosaurs now being gone, different types of mammals evolved from originally from the reptiles. And just as a side note here, some of these mammals eventually went back to the ocean. They kind of pulled an evolutionary U-turn. And if you think of the marine animals mammals we have now, like seals and sea lions and whales and dolphins, some of them, especially the whales and dolphins, look like fish. But if you look at them more closely, they don't have gills. They have lungs the way land mammals do. They nurse their young, unlike fish. They're warm-blooded. They have mammalian skeletons. They're just very obviously a mammal that has returned to the ocean. As a matter of fact, if you look at the skeletons of whales, you can see some structures right about here in the whale skeleton where there are residual hips, where their hip bones used to be that connected to some back legs, which have gone away at this point. And speaking of ourselves, we are evolutionary most related to gorillas and chimps. They think maybe around 4 million years ago was when we last shared a common ancestor with this group. We're most closely related to the chimpanzees and a little bit more distantly related to the gorillas. So if you could go back in time to around 4 million years ago, you would probably find something that looks a little bit like a small chimp. And some of those eventually evolved into current chimpanzees, and some of them evolved into ourselves. Here's an artist's conception of what some of these human ancestors may have looked like. Oop, go back. And here's something I ripped off from another book that shows what they think some of these human ancestors looked like, the most distant ones being around 4 million years ago. And generally the general trend would be a larger brain size and being a little bit taller. Some of our closest relatives are the Neanderthals, which they think we coexisted with for tens of thousands of years. They're not sure exactly when modern human beings evolved as a separate species, but one number that I read said 50,000 years ago, which you can see is not too distant from the Neanderthals, so there probably was some overlap between us. Okay, so that's all of evolution in 10 minutes. The next segment of your handout talks a little bit about some of the evidence that they've used. Why do they think this particular scenario took place? And why do they think birds are related to dinosaurs and humans to chimps? Well, there's various lines of evidence, and I think I'm just running out of time, so I just want to mention one of them real quick because it relates to some of the things we've studied. One line of evidence that supports this is what they call comparative molecular biology and biochemistry. And remember, molecular biology is studying DNA and RNA, and biochemistry normally means studying proteins. And so what they do is they compare the gene sequences and the protein sequences among different species. And the idea is that the closer two species are, evolutionary-wise, the closer sequences you're going to find in their DNA and in their proteins, just simply because since they have a common evolutionary ancestor fairly recently, the DNA has just not had time to mutate between the two species yet. And so this shows just the number of amino acids in one of those cytochrome proteins, or I should say the number of amino acid differences between comparing two cytochrome proteins. Remember, cytochromes, amongst other things, are involved in aerobic respiration. And if you look at a human being and a monkey, it just looks like one or two amino acids are different in our cytochrome proteins, in our mitochondria. But if you look at a pig and a duck and a turtle and a fish, which are further removed from us evolutionary-wise, you get more and more differences in the cytochrome proteins. And here's a similar comparison of one of the hemoglobin proteins, the differences in amino acids. Between ourselves and gorillas, there's only one amino acid different in the hemoglobin. But if you go a little bit further away evolutionary-wise, you get more and more differences in the amino acid sequence of the hemoglobin. Okay, well, I think I'll call it quits right then. So I will see you guys in the laboratory today. And anything that I didn't cover on the evolutionary lecture, I'm not going to ask you questions on in the final exam. So just the stuff we've gone over.